I want to do just a short video here to introduce you to the basic tasks of organizing. What in your book are called specialization, cooperation, and coordination, also sometimes broadly known as differentiation and integration. It goes something like this. Specialization, which is also called differentiation, is the breaking up of the work up into pieces. Almost any time we get a task for ourselves or with a group, we think about how can we break this up. And it makes good sense. Different people are good at different things. It's easier if you focus on particular things. Therefore, we want to specialize and each do different pieces of the work. However, ultimately, we have to bring up all the pieces back together to create a whole. This is called integration, and it involves a couple of steps. It involves cooperation, that is, getting the people to work together for the common good, to think beyond just themselves and their own interests and think about the larger organization's interest. And then the coordination. Once we get people committed to to cooperating, we have to figure out a way to ensure that everybody's got the right information, the flow of the work, to integrate or bring the pieces all back together. Diagrammatically, you can think of it as something like this. For high productivity, we do require specialization. However, specialization ultimately needs to be integrated, and you get two problems that come out of that. The first is the need for cooperation. What in your book is talked about as the agency problem. And there are various solutions we can look at to try to address that. Whether it's hierarchical supervision, aligning performance incentives, creating shared value, all of those things work to get people to be willing to cooperate. However, we've also then got to think about coordinating the work, because even if people are willing to, we've got to set it up in such a way that we can manage the interdependencies between the various tasks. And again, there are various solutions we can consider for that. Rules and directives, various organizational routines, ultimately mutual adjustment. The question then becomes how much and what kinds of coordination are needed between the different units. And to address this, we've got to think about the nature of the tasks and how we have broken them apart, what connections, if any, there are between them. And the reality is that most organizations will make use of a mix of different coordinating mechanisms, levels of specialization versus integration. One way we can think about this broadly is this notion coming out of contingency theory of mechanistic versus organic approaches to organizing. The mechanistic forms are what we tend to think of when we think of bureaucracy. Tasks are pretty rigid and highly specialized. Rules and direction comes from the top of the organization. Communication is almost all vertical up and down the chain. Top management centralizes key knowledge, and you report to immediate supervisors. That works pretty well in a stable environment without much uncertainty, where everybody can work on their own pieces, and you can trust some kind of basic integrating mechanisms to pull the pieces together. However, organic forms tend to be better when the world is a little less stable, when there's greater uncertainty, because here you require much greater coordination, and the organic form is much more flexible, more mutual adjustment within a common culture. Information flows as much horizontally as vertically, and knowledge is dispersed. We can break this down a little further with the notion of interdependency. Interdependency addresses the degree to which the different tasks are interrelated. And as a general rule, the greater the level of interdependency, the greater is going to be your need for coordination. The less interdependence there is, the less coordination will be needed. When we talk about interdependency, Thompson introduced three different notions that range from lowest interdependence to highest. The first type, pooled, is where everybody ultimately is dependent on everyone else, but on a day-to-day basis, week to week even, they don't have to directly interact with one another. And maybe one way to think about this are different locations of a franchise chain. What's going on at the McDonald's in Old Town doesn't really impact on a day-to-day basis what's going on at the McDonald's in Bangor, certainly not at the McDonald's in New York or in Dallas. So ultimately it all goes together. Ultimately what happens at one influences perhaps what happens to the other. But regular basis, not much interdependence. Sequential, an assembly line is probably a good way to think about this. The output of one unit becomes the input to another. And that means that units later in the chain become more dependent than those at the beginning because they have more steps that have to go right to make things get to them at the right time. So this has kind of a medium level of interdependence, and you can probably deal with it with various routines, with rules, and policies on what to do if there's a problem, how long things are supposed to take, etc. The third type of interdependency is reciprocal, where the work is truly interconnected and the output of one becomes the input of another, but then that unit's output turns back around and becomes an input of the first one. I think of this as something like perhaps you might see in a hospital in an emergency room where the doctor first has to look at the patient, but they may then need to send the patient for various tests or x-rays, other imaging. Once those tests and imaging are done, then it comes back to the doctor. And when those kinds of interdependencies are present, when it's very much reciprocal, then there's a lot of mutual adjustment that has to be done. There's a lot greater level of interdependency, and more complex approaches to coordination are necessary to make all the pieces function smoothly together. We care because the choices on specialization and coordination, driven often by interdependency, absolutely influence our decisions, how we're going to break up the tasks, how we're going to group the various tasks, and the coordinating mechanisms that would be most appropriate. Oh, we'll see how this shows up in the next video, where I'm going to talk to you about various structures.